Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Cloud Security Alliance Zero Trust Summit. And we're here with a great panel today, championing zero trust for critical infrastructure, protecting our most critical assets. And I'm really energized today to be joined by several friends and colleagues I've met over the years. And I'm going to let them give you each just a minute introduction about what they do at their current role and their expertise as it relates to this topic today with critical infrastructure. So we have Galina Antova from Clarity, Bryson Bort from Scythe, Mark Weatherford with the National Cybersecurity Center. And Galina, if you'll kick us off and just do a quick intro.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me, and great to be speaking to everyone today. So I'm the co-founder of Clarity, which is a company that designs products for securing critical infrastructure. My last 12 years or so of my career have basically been dedicated to cybersecurity and critical infrastructure and kind of establishing that as a segment in the market. Before Clarity, I started and ran industrial cybersecurity at Siemens. And prior to that, I did a bunch of work on the broader cyber landscape at IBM. So super excited to have had a opportunity to see this segment of the market develop, and super excited to be talking to all of you today about zero trust in critical infrastructure.
I'm a former Army officer. I co-founded a nonprofit called the ICS Village with Tom Van Norman. Our mission is education and advocacy for industrial control system security. I'm a senior technical advisor at the Institute for Security and Technology. I founded a consultancy 11 years ago that specialized in industrial control system risk assessments. And then in my current job as the CEO and founder at Scythe, we've built a threat emulation platform that allows folks to safely test both IT and OT together for a combined risk assessment.
Mark Weatherford. I am the Chief Strategy Officer at the National Cybersecurity Center, part-time, and work with a number of startups in the security space and the OT space. Been in and out of the public sector and private sector, been a multi-time CISO and both IT and OT organizations. And really happy to be here and talk about this very, very important topic.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to kick this off with a foundational question here, because obviously we've had critical infrastructure for many, many, many tens and dozens and scores of years. But recently we've had a pretty big spotlight on securing critical infrastructure and especially operational technology, environments that have cyber physical assets and systems in them. So I'm curious from your perspective, and I'm going to kick off with Galina here, on what's driving our focus right now. What has changed or what's evolving that have a new or renewed interest here?
Yeah, I would say I would separate it kind of like internally and externally. I think internally, the last 4 years or so, we saw absolute acceleration of digital transformation across the board. Obviously, a lot of that was driven because of the pandemic. And what that meant is that all of the convergence that we've been talking about in theory for quite a number of years was actually happening de facto, was happening, whether people were doing it by design or just by accident because systems needed to be connected. So that's kind of the internal side of things. And then once companies saw the cost benefits from digital transformation and the fact that those projects are actually doable, that drove a bunch of investments on the cyber front. So that's kind of the internal picture. On the external front, we all know what's going on in the world from geopolitics, and the simple math is that those industrial operational technology networks are valuable. Whatever is your profile as a threat actor, whether you're just doing it purely for financial reasons, ransomware, or you've got some national state interest, those networks are valuable because they make things happen in the real world. They drive production, they get us our gas and food. And so therefore there's a lot more urgency. And so threat actors have figured out that that's kind of like the weak spot. Obviously, from a cyber posture perspective, those are weaker compared to the IT networks. And so I think that that's what's driving a lot of the math in the increased interest that we're seeing. And a lot of it is just some of that stuff coming up to the surface and people talking about it more, right? Things were still happening a few years ago. I just think we had less awareness and less visibility in terms of like the security was coming from those networks.
Happy to chime in. So I always like to simplify this as, let's start with the impact. In IT, we have intellectual property, we potentially have financial loss, and that's a bad day. But a worse day is when you lose an arm or you lose your life. And that is realistically what the potential impact of anything to disrupt operation technology operating in a safe manner. Furthermore, I mean, our modern society rests on it. Without electricity and water, we go to the Stone Ages literally overnight, right? You flip that switch and everything stops. And then, of course, the threat itself, right? That represents opportunity in a risk model. Now we have to look at threat and motive. And we have had the US government publicly releasing information since 2010 of, you know, the proverbial nation state actors that have been operating in our networks. You could probably point to, well, there hasn't been a lot of disruption on that path, but I think what we're seeing is the iterative reconnaissance and tradecraft refinement, as well as the fact, as seen in reference to what Galina was talking about geopolitics, we can't ignore what's happening in Ukraine, and the recognition that you can't just all of a sudden start an attack on industrial control systems through cyber operations. It's something that requires a lot of planning and prior work. Then, I mean, I think where it was an operational technology environment with Colonial Pipeline in 2021, which I think led to two things. One, a silver lining. And the silver lining is ransomware is now what I call a kitchen table word. Your grandmother knows what ransomware is. And so in terms of us talking about the threat, while your grandmother might not be able to break down all of the TTPs of what ransomware is doing with Lockbit or some of the others, they now know what it is, which means take that into the executive environment. And no longer are we, the security practitioners, coming to them with previously what was basically a jargon word, like ransomware, what's that? Now, again, your grandmother knows. And the second part is due to Colonial Pipeline and a lot of other things, regulations are coming. So as with everything, compliance is the existential foundation of business. This is no different in critical infrastructure, which already had a heavily regulated presence, and now more is coming. And so as with everything, you're going to have to take that seriously.
Yeah, I would just, you know, I think, you know, both the internal and external kind of issues were discussed there, and I would just weigh in a little bit more on the government's involvement. I mean, not only is it just the legislature, and the legislature has gone crazy. I track cybersecurity related legislation, and I think 2 weeks ago, last time I checked, there were over 2,500 pieces of legislation that had cybersecurity in the title. So, you know, there's just, they're being inundated. The legislators are being inundated inundating us, I should say, with new potential pieces of legislation. And I always encourage people to pay attention to this, because legislation has consequences. You know, that means something somewhere down the road that we are going to have to live with. But so along with, you know, with the compliance and regulatory aspect of it, look at what's happening at CISA. CISA is the government's face for cybersecurity primarily right now, and they are just, you know, they're updating their output of items and reports and advisories on a daily basis. And while most of that is not a mandatory or regulatory kind of an issue for most of us, a lot of it either is or will be at some point. So again, things that we need to be paying attention, because the government has woken up to this. And as Bryson said, you know, we talk about security within OT, but safety is really what OT has traditionally been about. And when you start having security events that result in safety issues, the government is going to get more involved with that.
So let me ask this then, you know, kind of circling back around to some of the comments. And I think maybe it was Galina or maybe it was Bryson that made a sort of alluded to the weaknesses in the systems that we're dealing with, especially in operational technology environments and those cyber physical assets that are maybe not always worse, but certainly very different than what we deal with in traditional data IT networks. So my next question here is, you know, thinking through the weaknesses in the systems, thinking through this possibility for, you know, additional legislation and guidance we have coming out. And I know, Mark, we were just laughing because we get flooded with these emails, you know, daily. And directly from the different organizations, and then also, from my professional colleagues that forward it to me going, hey, did you see this? So,
Yeah, sometimes I think the White House and CISA is competing with each other to see who can release the most documentation.
yeah, I know the analysts all, they get paid based on the number of acronyms they coin, and I think the different federal agencies get it for the number of email blasts they send. So back to the next question, which is, what is a specific challenge that you see in securing OT and cyber physical systems, especially in critical infrastructure? And then where do you think our opportunity is to move past that or to address those?
Well, I'll start. I think, and this is not sexy at all, I think there's still cultural hurdles. IT is still seen as kind of a white collar profession, and OT is seen as a blue collar profession. And anybody, everybody here, if you've been in some of these environments, it's not just a casual thing. These people sometimes really don't like each other. So this cultural hurdle I think it's getting better. OT, IT, and you don't forget physical security too. You have to add the physical security people into this mix. But I think it's getting better, but they're still viewed as different disciplines within the same organization, and oftentimes, far too often, they exist in these silos that never talk to each other. They don't want to talk to each other. So I think breaking down those cultural hurdles is still one of the biggest challenges that I think is baggage for the OT community.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Humans are always the biggest problem, right? We can figure out the technology, the human relationships are always going to be there. And I have, however, seen quite a lot of improvement in that, Mark, over the years. And I would say one of the driving factors on the positive side of improving that was just kind of centralizing the budgets and the decision making for operational technology under the CISO and the security teams broadly. But back to your question, JJ, on the technical side, I think one of the kind of the category of the bigger challenge on the technology side is that the traditional security controls and the way we think about implementing those security controls on the IT side are just not doable on the OT side. And I'll just give you a couple of examples that are quite shocking, right? So like vulnerability management, right? Like addressing your vulnerabilities in your environments is absolutely fundamental when you think about cybersecurity. However, on the CPS, on the cyber physical side of the system, and by the way, that encompasses everything, it's not just industrial networks, it's healthcare devices, it's IoT devices, it's anything that has a cyber physical component. If you think about those environments, in many cases, you're not even able to like stop the process, whatever the process is, to apply those patches. Or in many cases, the software is running on operating systems that are not even supported, right? So because of the legacy cycles, because of the uptime requirements, because of the safety requirements, things look very different. And then if you think even about where teams are spending their time, like I think some of the stats that I was prepping for another talk were something like 70 to 80% of the CPS vulnerabilities disclosed within the last year have a CVSS score of like higher critical, which is like, oh my God, existential, you must fix that. However, only about 8% of those get exploited, right? So what that means is that if you're doing a traditional vulnerability management in CPS, your team is going to go and basically prioritize the CVEs based on the criticality of the scores. And if you do that, your team will be only about 4% efficient. So that means that like 96% of your team's time is just going to be completely wasted, right? Some other shocking stats, it's like if you think about hospitals, 63% of the known exploited vulnerabilities in the CISA's KF catalog, which is the known exploitable vulnerabilities, can be found on healthcare networks, right? Those are like the hospitals that are so prone to like ransomware attacks. And so the networks and the devices and how they're treated looks very different. Yes, people are preaching for a long time physical segmentation between IT and OT, and yes, in many cases there is that. The reality is that in many cases it's just not possible, or it's de facto converged because of digital transformation projects. So I think our focus, what I've seen on the positive side, is that in the last 2-3 years, the focus has really shifted to, okay, what is an effective security control, rather than us trying to just do copy paste from what we know from the IT world, to be able to address those challenges. And I think this is where the topic of this conversation, zero trust as a concept, specifically for critical infrastructure, is so essential, right? Because we have to move away from that concept of physically segmented networks to more of like identity-based zero trust segmentation, both in terms of like access and segmentation, those kind of principles. And it's not one technology that can implement all of that. It really is the concept of like, how do you build like your security stack and the security principles.
I really like the example of vulnerability management, because I've actually learned so much more from vulnerability management in OT than I did in IT. In IT, it's a compliance requirement versus real security. And I run my scanner. I feel safe running my scanner because I'm in an IT environment. I'm not going to break anything like I do in OT. And I get the list. The list is long. And as Galina noted, right, most folks just kind of look at the top of the CDSS score and go, that's my priority. And I knock a few of those out. And I come back and I run the scanner the next day, and it's the same length because more vulnerabilities have been added. What have I accomplished? And so we are so desperate for metrics in this space. And so we look at that and go, well, what's our efficiency of basically beating system owners over the head to patch high criticals within an SLA of whatever the hours, whatever the days are. And that's what we call it a day, right? And there's really just two options, right? I beat them over until they patch it, or we accept the risk, right? And that's it. That's what we do. But in OT, patching it already is not just an option. A lot of these things are so old. I always joke, how do you know what an industrial control system is? It's any computer that's at least 20 years old. And so you can't patch it, right? These things are end of life, which really leads to what that third option is. And I really want to pull this out of what Galina was saying, which is we as security partners can come up with compensating controls, because I can't directly affect the vulnerability itself, right? So I can control how you get to it. I can control detections around it. So detective and preventative controls are my compensating controls. We as a security organization need to be partners with that. Going back to the original question, so JJ and I are partners in crime and co-teach industrial control systems. And I do a number of consulting calls with different folks. And the most common thing I get from asset owners all the time is they are primarily still in the maturity phase of what do I got? And then how do I manage that? And this is where I feel like Galina intentionally wasn't talking about this, because this is what Galina's product does. Clarity is there helping with the discovery and the asset management of these pieces, because it's such a critical piece. I mean, 80 to 90% of security is configuration management. And so I know Galina doesn't want to like tout her own, toot her own horn on this, but that's what Clarity does for the industry. And so when I'm talking to folks, I see that. It's right. How do I discover stuff? How do I get a decent configuration management insight of what do I got, establishing those states? And then from there, this is where we get to the zero trust, because once I do that, again, going back to the key third pillar as a vulnerability management approach is architecture. I need to architect thinking east-west and north-south in my operational technology zones and figuring out how do I build resilience into that, right? Maybe that robot arm should not be on the same network as that, CNC saw or whatever those pieces are. And I need to be thinking through that and establishing resilience at that level so that I can also reduce impact. And then coincidentally, extra credit, I also get the monitoring points at that. So I'm building up a detective place for my compensating controls. The last thing I want to throw in there in terms of like, what can we do? We've mentioned CISA, and CISA has been a great clearinghouse for KEVs, which was a big step forward. We've seen ONCD just push out their workforce development. But when you start to think about the scale of this problem, we've already talked about the impact. We talked about what's happening. Like just looking at water plants, there are 150,000 of them in the United States. And Galina noted, right, they have one IT person at most of them, right? And the joke I always make is his name is Gary. I've had him tell me his name is Steve, but the IT guy's name is always Gary. And that's not even a security person, right? That's just the IT guy, the proverbial IT guy who's there, trying to make everything work. Doesn't have time to go and hunt down the KEVs, doesn't have time to do anything with this stuff. And so my challenge to government is we need to be providing more solutions, and going back to Galena's comment, less paper.
Speaking of paper and inventory, I mean, I think one of the things Bryson said, we're partners in crime here. I think one of the challenges that he has when we are doing some of this work consulting is, I think he wants our audience to be a little further down the path to do some of the cool stuff and have some of those conversations. But what we're seeing is there is this discrepancy, and the cultural aspect of it and the relationships, Mark, that you were talking about in Galena, but also just the education part of it, where the traditional security professionals, the traditional IT professionals coming from that space, and even the office of the CISO very rarely have any type of expertise from the other side of the fence, right? From that other either physical security group or those OT operators. So part of it is just, this cultural piece is solving through the education, which is one of the reasons I was really eager and excited about this panel and you guys coming on together, because I think this is a great move forward. And, the asset inventory part is one of the conversations we keep having over and over again. And this is something I think we don't get right on the IT side, and we certainly don't get it right past the IT side when we don't have the same type of ability really to throw an agent on stuff and then have that report back and tell us what and where it is. And, people joke about, okay, we don't have CMDBs that are up to date. We talk about, Excel files, but I've walked into utility clients that literally had index cards, like pieces of paper, index cards that they were keeping in a little binder with equipment information written on it. And that was their inventory. So moving off of this paper onto anything that's digital, I think is a step forward. And then, thinking through the zero trust principles that you mentioned, we definitely have to get a handle on what we have and what those things are communicating to and from, and hopefully move past something that's static and digital into something that's a little bit more dynamic and digital. So I'm going to circle back to something you mentioned there about the convergence and the forced convergence, and then sort of this false segmentation between IT and OT, and that there are times and reasons. And Galena, I'm looking at you first here. There are reasons that we might have to have some type of communication between these systems. So this tug of war where we have some legacy architectures that are integrated, perhaps not by design, but just by negligence or organic growth. And we have some vendors that are pushing us towards convergence. We have products rolling out in both the utility and the healthcare space saying, hey, we'll handle your weird officey IoT stuff and your OT, CPS devices together in one platform. And then you have a lot of us saying, hey, we need to keep some better segmentation here because that's all we have. So, starting with Galena, I'm curious on your thoughts around when is it appropriate? What do we combine? When is that appropriate? And when do we need to keep some segmentation?
Yeah, it is really the conversation is on a spectrum. And again, what I'm describing is the way I'm observing the world, not the way the world should be, right? When you read like the standards, we're like, okay, this is how you do everything with critical infrastructure. The reality is that the picture is extremely different. And it is very different, again, because of digital transformation, because of the need for growth, because of companies expanding, all of the things that we talked about. And again, just to kind of keep into perspective some of the numbers, because I just did the research on this, a couple of weeks ago. So right now, today, there's anywhere between 15 to 17 billion connected IoT devices, right? And many of those are operational technology ones, right? And by next year, Gartner is estimating that those devices are expected to generate more than 80 billion IoT connections. And over 70% of those will be in the critical infrastructure sectors. So what I'm saying is that the data from what we see from out there is that the technology world has converged, right? We can debate whether it's good or bad or what drove it, but that is the reality. And so now, what is it that what are the security controls that we can apply to that, right? I think it's naive and simplistic to think that physical segmentation could help with everything. In some cases, it's just like physically impossible. It will take large companies dozens of years to like literally do the physical segmentation. So then if that is practically not a possibility, we have to think about different alternatives. Of course, if we're talking about nuclear power plants, right, it's a completely different story. But if we're talking about manufacturing or like data centers or the data centers of banks or commercial real estate, with the different type of assets come different kind of profiles. And the metric I think that is most important to track is time to risk reduction, right? It's not absolute. It's not in some point in the future, in 15 years from today, you're going to have perfect security. That's not going to happen. The question is, what can you apply today that will give you maximum risk reduction? This is what we're going after. And if we think about it from this perspective, the zero trust principles really apply because you cannot guard a network, right? Because of all of these inadvertent connections that we have for different reasons. You need to go down to like the asset profile. You need to go down to like the profile of the workstation, and even in some cases, the workloads, and to start thinking about ZTNA and ZTNS principles around that, right? So in some cases, it will be identity-based microsegmentation. In other cases, it will be zone and conduits with some rules around them. Physical segmentation, absolutely, where it's feasible, but we have to have a layered approach of what is possible. And as Bryson mentioned, the absolute prerequisite for all of that is us being able to quickly identify what the asset is, what is the profile of that asset, who does it communicate, who is it communicating with, and all of that. And by the way, it sounds so basic, but it's the absolute most challenging thing that I think we have in cybersecurity, not just in OT, but in IT, which is why there's so many companies doing so well in that space, helping us identify what is it that we have. And especially those devices that cannot an agent. How do we find those devices? How do we profile them? That's the absolute basic step that everybody must start with.
Go on, Mark.
Galina said it, but I have nothing to add. I mean, the only thing that I guess that I would foot stomp on is convergence has already happened. I mean, everybody's in some stage of convergence now. It is inevitable. There's simply too many inefficiencies or too many efficiencies and cost savings to be realized. So companies, they've made the decision. Now we need to figure out how do we do it effectively in security by employing zero trust principles to this digital transformation.
Okay, so kind of keeping in the same theme of digital transformation and just sort of the evolution of convergence and what we're dealing with in the world and the climate, both from a threat perspective and political climate here. We've had some news in the past several months of new tool sets, new attack vectors, PIPEDREAM being one of them, which is a collection of tools. So I'm going to start with Bryson on this one. And I'm kind of curious what's your feeling, given your history in this space. What are some things that organizations should be thinking about now and in the future, possibly different than they've been doing in the past?
Sure. First, to orient the audience, PIPEDREAM is the Dragos name for a most likely Eastern European, rhymes with Usha, intelligence groups building it. It's the equivalent of the military cyber weapon. It actually, its lineage appears to go back to 2015, where we first saw what was called Indestroyer. since was that 2015. So we've seen 8 years of basically carefully crafted code for these purposes, right? It was like Stuxnet. It was built for a particular reason. And here's my thing. It's like defending O-Day in IT. Sure, you could spend a lot going to that. Sure, you might be a target for it, but there's so many lower hanging fruit to go after versus what I would call as the Hollywood threat. Again, it's out there, it's a thing, but let's look at what the most common threat vectors are. IT is still the large squishy attack surface that is doing what it's supposed to do. Connect to the internet to do business operations as a modern IT security, a modern business that rests on IT. And what is the most common access vector to that? People, through phishing, through social engineering, through business email compromise. We haven't solved those problems, and we probably never will, right? Access is something that will happen eventually, and it only takes one email to get in. So they're in. Now what? They pivot laterally through your network, and they look for, how do I cross into what I call the beachhead? The high-level industrial control systems that run everything. And here's the thing about those high-level industrial control systems. They run an out-of-date operating system like everything else that's typically Linux or Windows. So whatever it took for me to get here to there, it just got easier. And two, I don't have to do anything else. Once I control an HMI, I just tell the HMI to do what I want it to do. I slide it this way, and the programmable logic controller down there just does what I tell it to do. I don't need to do any really custom stuff, right? I get the effects of access and impact that I was looking for just by controlling the high-level systems that are already organically architected to see everything, to do everything, and speak all the proprietary protocols of all of those things itself. That's your primary threat logic. That's what we should be defending at. I say, don't worry about the Hollywood military stuff.
100% nothing to add.
I have nothing to add, but well, I guess I do. I think, when you said, what are some things that organizations should be thinking about now? There are a whole lot of things, but I think having an ICS specific incident response program is really important. I've seen too many of these things where there will be some kind of an incident and they slap up their okay, here's the playbook for an IT incident, and they don't map. They literally don't map together. So having an ICS specific incident response program is really important. And even this is different even between sectors. Oil and gas is different from electricity. Manufacturing is different from pipelines. And if you think you're just going to have one generic incident response plan for anything that happens in your organization, you're in for a rude awakening when you have to employ this. So, I mean, they're essentially the same. The fundamentals are the same, but I think, as I mentioned earlier, responses are different because it's often safety as well as security, which isn't typically part of an IT IR plan.
So what I think I heard Bryson say was not to get like all razzled dazzled by the starry Hollywood attacks and the headline news with stuff, because we're still failing in some of the fundamentals. And I agree with that. I mean, I think in my 20 plus years of consulting, primarily in security, it's talking to a lot of organizations and customers and CISOs and CIOs who really want to purchase and implement whatever the latest Gartner hype thing or Forrester or fill in the blank, right? This shiny thing, and probably whoever's in the right side of the graph or the wave or the quadrant or whatever. And a lot of times it's something like, honeypot and, some of these more advanced technologies where they don't even have multi-factor turned on for admin authentication and privileged access management. And so I think just across the board, the basics and the fundamentals of good hygiene and 101 level practices, all the vanilla stuff that, like Mark said earlier, it's not sexy, but we're just still failing at it. So with that foundation, let me ask the next question is, we've talked about that, digital transformation is already happening. That ship has sailed. Convergence is happening, and organizations need to be, thoughtful about how they sort of chase that and pursue security controls for it. So in the world where we have systems that are a little weaker, we have those squishy areas that make it easy for attackers to get into those, and we still feel like maybe we're not doing the basics well. Do you have some advice for organizations to safely reach a maturity point so that they can take advantage of all of these new technologies and digital transformation in a safer way?
Well, I guess one thing that, I think we need to continue to push back against the vendor community. This has changed a lot. And thankfully, to companies like Clarity, who are kind of pushing the envelope on this, but, still a lot of the major manufacturers, well, I shouldn't say still, they've gotten the religion, but, it has taken a long time for them to say, okay, even if customers aren't begging us for this, we are going to start building security into, fundamental things like default passwords. And I mean, just really simple stuff that we finally, I just think we the community, the organization, OT organizations need to just push the vendors for better security. That's going to move the bar far faster than anything else, and I see devices were built to last a long time. They weren't built to evolve. So this mindset of, just like we buy a new laptop computer every 3 or 4 years, that's a different mindset in the OT community. So we have to push the vendors to, I guess, acknowledge that.
So Mark, let me ask you, you mentioned something like 2,500 pieces of current legislation that reference cybersecurity. A lot of those obviously are geared towards critical infrastructure and IoT. Do you think are we getting the right kind of help from legislation and from frameworks like 62443 that are pushing those vendors to do more? Is it enough, or do we need to do something more?
Yeah. So I think 62443 is absolutely, it's pushing everybody in the right direction. This is going to sound negative, and I don't mean to say, because I have a lot of friends in government, but if you look at these 2,500 plus pieces of legislation, 90% of them are BS. I mean, they're just the legislator getting their name on a bill. That's Weatherford's opinion. But when you get down to the no kidding ones that can actually move the ball, yeah, I think they're important. But everybody's heard me say this 1,000 times. If your legislator doesn't have your name on a sticky or on an index card on their desk somewhere, that shame on you, because these legislators don't understand the technology. They depend on us to help them. So call them up and just say, hey, if you ever have a question about this, call me. I'm happy to help. But don't charge any money for this. This is just me contributing back. And you would be surprised how often they will call you back.
I'm glad, before Galena jumps in, I'm glad you said that, because I know several of us have seen, some of the guidance, such as in OT, coming out of the federal government saying replace legacy systems.
Lack of OT.
Yes.
Yeah.
But, replace legacy systems, remove all external access into the environment. And, we're just over here kind of, like wave your magic fairy dust sprinkles over there.
I just want to add to something that Mark said, because Mark has actually participated in this conference. That's actually what Hack the Capitol, our annual policy conference in DC, is meant to do, is connecting all the different communities with the members of Congress and the staffers and think tanks and the industry, so that all of those folks are, it's not necessarily what you're getting from the lectures and the labs there, but it's those relationships to build, so that because they do reach out. They really are trying to do that. It's kind of hard to get past K Street sometimes.
Yeah, and I want to give credit where credit is due. So there were a couple of, I think, legislations that were the regulations that were pushed out that are going to eventually really affect the landscape. One of those was the FDA recently gaining authority over medical device security. I mean, I mentioned the stats about medical devices earlier. You know, that will absolutely create a shift in the liability for those device manufacturers, because now they must focus on and prioritize cybersecurity as they're bringing new devices to market. But again, long legacy cycle. So that's one. Following the Colonial Pipeline, you know, the TSA came out with a lot of directives for pipeline and rail and air. So those are all like good movements in the right direction. But yeah, there's a lot more to be done.
Awesome. Wrapping up here in the last few minutes, let me ask each of you if you have some maybe parting words of wisdom or a resource or two that you would recommend, whether it's an online resource, white paper, guidance, podcast, event. And I see Bryson jiggling like he's ready to say something. So I'm going to start with Bryson.
Oh no, that's actually my war injury and my back hurts. Sure, but I'm excited too. Resources to share. So with our nonprofit, the ICS Village, we are just finishing up our third season of our podcast, Hack the Plant. I think that's a fun podcast because we just go to all the different parts of different elements of critical infrastructure from different angles around the world. And we keep it at a level everybody can access because it can get pretty obtuse sometimes.
Yeah, and I would add to that. So I think that the biggest asset that we have as a community is each other and learning from like on the ground what happened, whether that's how to implement security controls, what to do post breach, you know, how to put things together. And so in an effort to help that, you know, a couple of years ago at Clarity, we started running a conference, which was not a paid conference, just basically bringing the community together. It's not a Clarity conference. We're not promoting anything. We're not advertising anything. We've run it now. It's called Nexus. We've run it now for 2 years, bringing together about 300 cybersecurity executives, specifically and 100% focused on critical infrastructure, and putting on stage CISOs, sharing their stories, you know, government officials. That has resonated extremely well with the community. And so I would welcome everyone to go and look it up. It's the Nexus conference. And throughout the year, we run a kind of thought leadership portal that's called nexusconnect.io, which is where we have interviews with like asset owners and other thought leaders in the industry of how they're hands-on tackling that for the community. And I think some of the best pieces of advice that the community can get is from other asset owners, operators of critical infrastructure.
So I know we've talked about it. We've mentioned it a couple of times. I think CISA is a great resource. I just looking right now. CISA has issued 15 advisories this week already. In fact, just yesterday, they released 6 industrial control system advisories. Now, again, it can clog up your inbox very quickly with all of these. But I think it's also pretty easy to weed through and say, okay, this one applies to me, or this one's interesting to me, or these are not. So, you know, I think being on distribution for the CISA advisories and alerts is really important, and it's free. And you know, these are, you know, as we were talking earlier, Fortune 500s, you know, they have their own set of issues, but it's what I call the unfortunate 5,000 is the organizations, you know, that lack the kind of resources, and this actually means something to them.
The cyber poor, yeah, absolutely.
How have I not heard the cyber poor referenced before? I'm going to have to borrow that one.
Well, so the original phrase goes back to 2013 to Wendy Nather. She talked about the cyber poverty line. So you have the haves and the have-nots.
Yes. Love Wendy. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Bryson, Galina, Mark, everybody listening. We have a little bit more content for you the rest of today here at the CSA Zero Trust Summit. You can find more information on the CSA website, and we hope to see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.